welcome to my dad's podcast, My Black is Transnational. Follow him on Instagram. Hope you enjoy the show.
You are listening to My Black is Transnational. My name is Dr. Kalechi Ibe Lambers, and I'd like to welcome you all for joining me on today's episode. Wherever you are, whenever this time is for you. So if this is your first time listening to My Black is Transnational, this is a show that focuses on reconnecting and talking about the issues of transnationalism and how it connects and how it relates as far as the black community is concerned. How can we build ties and build bridges in order to become a more unified black community? So if this is your first time, please make sure to rate and review the podcast. And if you like what you hear today on this episode, please feel free to subscribe. And you can listen to other episodes that I have released in the past on your favorite podcast listening apps. And I just want to hear your feedback. I'd like to hear what you think. If the show is trash, that's perfectly fine. If the show is great, then please continue to support. And even if it is trash, then please send your feedback and let me know what I can do to become a better host for you and for others who feel likewise. So, man, today's episode, we're focusing on kings and queens and royalty. And the reason this happened, or this came into my spirit, was because the last episode I talked about, kind of alluded and reflected on the life of Nipsey Hussle, and also talked about hometown associations in the transnational community. But I also focused the latter part of it on the life of Nipsey Hussle and what it meant. And as things went on and the procession of his funeral and burial went on, a lot of times you just kept on seeing people saying, "Rest up, young king, rest up, young king." And at first I was just like, okay, this is cool. But then, Game of Thrones, so this is kind of just tells you when this show is being recorded, but Game of Thrones is on the horizon, right? So I started thinking about Game of Thrones and kings and queens. So this theme just kept coming from different places, and I started to think like, man, okay, this concept of kings and queens has been very pervasive for the past, and let me not use big words, it's been around for a while, as far as the past couple of years, and people have been really hyping it up. And then what really motivated it was the explosion of Black Panther, right? So when Black Panther came on, everybody was really hype on this whole concept of black royalty. Everybody was talking about kangs and queens, and everybody was so hype on it. And it was necessary. And I think at that point it was very powerful and uplifting for the black community. But I had to be that guy. And I know some of the things that I will mention may not be the most popular opinion, and some of y'all may not like it, and I perfectly understand it. But I really started to reflect and really muse on why are we the only ones as black people that really get hype on it? You don't see people from other particular groups, race and ethnic groups, really hype on this whole concept of kings and queens, right? You don't see anyone in the Asian Pacific community really use this terminology as a form of endearment to one another. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not to say that these things don't matter. And I do understand the premise and the history, at least, of this particular trend, as it being inspired by the fact that as black people, we are the Aboriginal people, and that our history ties into some form of royalty that may even trace all the way back to the Egyptian days and things of that nature, and so on and so forth. I get that. Truly. I feel that. But, family, we can't all be kings and queens. Like, who gonna do the work? Like, if everybody's royalty, then who's gonna be the one to actually do work, right? And there's this polarization of you either got to be a king and queen or you a pauper, you're a peasant. and you low class. And what it does to me is I feel like it starts to go from a term of endearment to now, or a term that's used affectionately, to a point where people start to use it as a way to become almost classist, but also I think it kind of goes against history. And I'm going to talk about this from a historical standpoint at first, and then I'll talk about it from a standpoint of what it really means as far as its application in the black community now. I'll talk about the use of it in the African community, because African immigrants are not exempt from this. A lot of our people come as well to the US, and they're telling other people, oh, my uncle used to be a king, my auntie used to be a queen, my daddy is a prince from this village, and kinikon. All those things are also being part of the narrative. So it's just this whole concept of black people and royalty as a whole. Right, so it's not one of those separate groups. One group is doing it, the other one. We're all doing this as a black community, and I want to know a little bit about why this is the case. And I hope that I can get some responses from you after listening to this about why. And I forgot to mention, follow me on Instagram at blacktransnational_, or you can shoot me a tweet on Twitter, MBI Transnational. And you can also send me an email, blacktransnational17@gmail.com. So you can holler at me any way you want to, and we can talk about this and have a really productive conversation. So I didn't want to just talk about this blindly, right? So I decided to kind of do a little bit of digging about the whole concept of where did this royalty come from? Like, where did this whole concept of royalty, what was its genesis? And so the history, at least from what historians tell us, right? There's a really important quote that I always take from my good brother, Frederick Douglass Dixon. All right, not Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass Dixon, who's a professor at Wyoming, and he always says, "History never lies; historians do." So I always have to put that as a disclaimer when I talk about what history has to offer. Now, historically, it says that the whole concept of royalty started off because as civilization started to come together, as people started to come together and build tribes and realize that they can't live this life alone, right? You start to realize that people had different roles. Some were either hunters, right, and people were croppers and farmers, but they had roles as far as how they would go about surviving, right, and they would move together in groups. Now, the hunters lived a more nomadic life. They worked less. They weren't as dependent on things such as the season, the weather, and things of that nature. Right? So they weren't as dependent on nature and its elements in order to survive. So they had to go where the animals were. So they weren't bounded by certain things compared to the farmers and the croppers, where they had a little bit more that contributed to their ability to produce. But because of that, once you find a good land and you find a land that's fertile, that means now you have something. You've pretty much landed on a gold mine. So if you have you found a land that allows you to be able to plant crops and grow crops, especially during the right season, you start to you harvest them, and then you start to store them. And as time continues to go, I should say, pun intended, people who were the croppers started to reside and settle in these lands, and as their crops continued to flourish and they started to grow more and more, they had to find places in which they can store these things, right? And they had to entrust people who could store and watch and monitor these things. So that led to the division of land. And when you started to divide land, that's when the whole feudal system started, right? So those who were truly responsible and well skilled and were the proper owners of these lands were essentially suited as kings. And then this whole thing, you had different titles, lords, and then you had all these other things that were kind of passed on down as far as roles and responsibilities. So once people started to settle into these lands where resources are available in plenty, you have to find a way to divide them. You have to find roles and responsibilities. Civilization started to evolve and become cities, and regions started to grow. So that's just a long story short, a more simplified version of how these things started to come into play. Now, what really made the whole concept of royalty stick was not just the fact that, oh, this person had the most resources, but then you had religion, that came into play. When we talk about the concept of now, you started off with priest kings, right? These were people who felt like they were divinely ordained to have these positions and be in this state of rulership over these lands of resources. They were blessed by God or the supreme architect of the universe to have this ability, to have this fortune, to be able to produce these lands and therefore have these resources. And it was their right divinely to be able to rule over this particular land. So the whole concept of religion became the glue that kept people together, right? And really kept people in consensus with who their leader is or was at that time. So religion definitely plays a role, and if you notice throughout the history of kings and kingdoms and things of that nature, there's always some form of supreme being that or deity that they believe in that essentially guides their kingdom's mission and agenda in most cases. Not necessarily in the case of an emperor, but in most cases that's how it really went down. Okay, so doing some digging, I was, I had to come with some facts and come correct as far as my knowledge base goes. Now we understand that there are some of us whose ancestry ties into royalty, maybe, but a lot of us may also have ancestors who were farmers or who were hunters or who ended up getting other jobs except for kings and queens. The reason that this is important is because when you start to think about the notion, or you start to think about what it means to be a king and queen, or a queen, or a prince, or a princess, when you start to give yourself these titles of royalty, I really believe that people don't truly understand what it entails. Because as a society, we are blinded by the by the glitter and the vanity that comes with the title of being kings and queens. In the black community specifically, in the African American community specifically, there is no correlation by the way we address ourselves as kings and queens to the way most of the time we conduct ourselves. Now, when I say that, I don't necessarily just mean that you have to conduct yourself in a pompous manner or act like you better than everybody else or not. But I don't really think that people understand what it takes to be king, what it takes to be queen, the weight of the crown. Right? I believe everyone, what bothers me is that I believe everyone feels like if you call each other kings and queens, and it's supposed to automatically uplift it. But there isn't anything that we do in our daily practices that truly exemplify the pressure of living that royal life, right? And I don't want people to not have pride in their ancestors being farmers, being, sharecroppers, being merchants and masons and whatever the case may be. Because I think what it does then, it creates this classist divide in our history that has been stripped away from most of us. So when we start to create this history of trying to connect this simply just to kings and queens, I think you do yourselves an injustice. You're doing yourselves an injustice by not truly wanting to understand who you really are. What it does is it just gives people an excuse to just kind of create these fake transnational ties by saying, yeah, we was kings and queens back in Africa, but none of y'all want to really go back to Africa. Right? Like, none of y'all really want to build that bridge and really try to see if you really royalty or not. And even if it was, like, what happened then? Right? Like, so I think the concept in my mind has been watered down to the point where now when you use the term royalty in the black community, people aren't going to take it seriously because it's used by everybody. People don't in other parts of the world, people don't play with that terminology, right? When you think about a really good example, when I used to really think that term was cool, and it was like, being king it shouldn't be that crazy, right? Like, I watched the whole season of The Crown, and I don't know any of y'all who watched that show on Netflix, and it's a show that talks about the life of Queen Elizabeth when she was given the throne after her father had passed away, King George, and she was next in line for the throne. And it shows the real, to some degree, obviously because it is made for TV, so there is some fiction to it, but there it shows the harsh realities that come with being royalty. And that comes with the pressure of people looking to you to make decisions, to make choices, and to live in a way in which you have not much control and much freedom that you think you do. When it comes to how you make decisions that impact yourself or your family, you always have to put your family and the dynasty first, right? So, I mean, when I think about it and just all the things that she went through, obviously she was a white privileged woman, whatever. But when I think about how it applies to how we conduct ourselves in the black community and we use these terms very lightly, the reality is, and some people won't like it, we don't carry ourselves in such manner. You know, my dad used to always tell me, like, a real king, they don't just sit on the throne, right? Kings and future, you know, owners of that title, that throne, so to speak, they have to go in the trenches. They're sent in the trenches to work, to understand the people that they serve, to understand how to serve them, because you understand their perspective. A lot of these people in the royal ranks are put in spaces where they have to understand the needs of the people. Not all, I'm not going to speak for all, but a lot of them do. Warrior kings, you have to work yourself from the ground up. You have to work in the trenches. You have to understand who you're leading to point them in the right direction. For those who've read books such as The Prince, created by Machiavelli, who was teaching the Medici how to rule his land once he got his throne in the Renaissance days, you start to see that there's a lot more that comes with being royalty than we tend to really act on. So this might be a little bit of a rant, whatever, but I also think that it's important for me as a black transnational to hold my brothers and sisters who may or may not be using these terms lightly or not, but it's just a caution. If you don't use this word and you don't like it, then use it as a cautionary tale for someone else. This thing can be it can contaminate black history. It has a potential to impact how we are going to build, how we going to view building our connections with Africa, or not. So I have to speak on it from a transnational perspective because my goal is to try and connect African Americans who were stripped of that history back to their native homelands, so they can build those bridges. That's my ultimate goal. So part of that is trying to understand what the history entails. So when you create this false or unproven identity of being in the historical bloodlines, I think that leads to this false self inflated perception that you create of you, and you take that term lightly, and I don't think that's something we should do. If you want to, use that on an isolated case, then, go ahead, be the king of your household, be the king of your job, whatever. But I think when we talk about it, and some of us do on a serious level, about how we used to be kings and queens and we are black royalty, not all of us. Because if everyone is 99% kings and queens, then who's doing the work? This world was built by workers, directed and led by kings and queens and emperors and all that stuff. But there's so much pressure on those who wear the crown. And I think sometimes as black people, we always want to go for the flash, but no one wants to talk about the guts and the glory and the grind, right? And that's, again, not to go back to a past episode, but that's again why someone like Nipsey Hussle really stood out to me and really was affected. I mean, the death was really affected in the world, because his loss, took away a messenger who really spoke about the grind and embraced it and what it meant to the black community, and how you work your way up to earn that status of royalty, because everyone sees you grinding, everyone sees you helping others and serving and leading and pointing to the right direction, taking care of those who look up to you because they know you have the resources, right? You don't leave your community, you don't leave your people and go somewhere else. You come back and you serve. And that, to me, is the markings or the makings of true royalty. Okay, so now Dr. Ebay Lamberts, you wilding out. You are not being sensitive to the history of those who were slaves, who are, whose ancestors were slaves and being in in the United States were treated in inhumane, ways that this world would never understand, right? So this is the message I'm probably going to be getting from those who may feel like, yo, we use this term as a way to uplift, right? As a way to say, keep your head up, young king, right? You come from a history of people who were rulers, right? Who were, royalty, maybe, right? And that's cool, right? Okay, fine. Let's say we want to do that. If we want to go that route. But why can't you be happy to know that you just came from a family who were lords and dukes and who were, high class merchants, who were people who were making an impact in their own villages and tribes, who were leaders in different ways, who were warriors, right? Why can't we, why can't that just be a term used for those who were hunters, right? Prideful hunters. Right? There's something that comes in that people talk about the whole wolf pack mentality, right? So, I mean, like I said, we have different ways in which we want to use to motivate each other. This podcast is not created simply, or this episode, I should say, is not made with the intention of trying to really downplay or smother that narrative all the way. I'm simply using this as a cautionary episode or a message to tell you all the possible consequences that will come in the future if these terms are not used and people aren't actually following suit. If you all want to consider yourselves kings and queens and princes and princesses, act like it. Hold yourself to that notion. But understand what it entails. Understand that we can truly all be kings and queens. If that's what you want to do, if you understand the simple concept of what it means to be royal, there's more to it than just the name. There's more to it than just reaching out to the pain of your history and using it as a tool to just uplift and then leave it at that for an emotional drive. There is truth that you may have some bloodlines and some history that ties into royalty. Obviously, Africa as a continent, there were different types of nations and tribes that battled each other, that worked together, that collaborated and grew, right? They had their own levels of royalty, whether it's from a tribal notion, right? When you had kings of your own tribes and different types of the Zulu nation and all the other historical components that came with that. So their history is there to some degree. So I'm not disagreeing with that. But what I'm saying is that this term has become so watered down to the point where it's become ahistorical, right? And what it does is it's going to create a division where people don't necessarily appreciate the history that comes with being black. You don't appreciate the fact that you have to be prideful of just being of your ancestors being farmers. Be okay with that. Be prideful of that. Be prideful of the fact that your ancestors built nations on nations. You had a people who were stripped away, who may have been royalty, that was stripped away from their nation, their people, their family, their bloodlines, taken, abused, and built a nation again. They rebuilt a culture that is revered and loved by everyone across the world, whether they want to admit it or not. African American culture, as I always say, is one of the most popular, most money-making culture that I've ever seen and the world may ever see. No other culture is that prominent. All right. So I feel like people should take pride in that. All right. But I'm gonna shift gears now because I think I've beat on that dead horse for a while now, and I'll talk about the African immigrant community, because you're not exempt too, my fellow Nigerian, Ghanaians, and Africans all across the continent. You're not exempt. You too abuse the whole concept of kings and queens, and your history might be a little bit different. You know why? Because of corruption. You come from a nation of corrupt people that are pretty lawless and have been colonized as well, and have been polluted and abused by white people and other nations, and their ways and their habits have also permeated into that culture of that nation, that led to a different level of corruption and a different way in which black people view themselves and how they separate themselves from their brothers and sisters across the world. So, you know, historically, I mean, we understand that African immigrants have a better ability to be able to trace their ties, maybe compared to someone in the United States that has ancestors who were slaves. Now, there are a lot of African immigrants or even African people today who will tell you, yo, my dad was a king of his village, or my mom was the queen of her village. I'm going to be real with y'all. There might be a likelihood of that, but how did that happen? How is your dad the king of this nation that was colonized by the British rule? There can't be two kings in a nation. So if you are from Nigeria and your dad was a king or queen, or your mom was a queen, or all these other things that we use to connect to royalty, how did that happen during the times of colonizations, the times of colonies, I should say? The reality is that a lot of these connections, sure, even before colonization became a thing, a lot of these connections came from those tribal wars, right? And the whole concept of resources and fighting for resources and territory. That's the makings of civilization in the world, and wars that happen throughout. War is about resources, war is about politics. But a lot of these things are not really real. A lot of times your dad may be the father. I mean, your dad's father may have been a king of his village, but the village, I mean, they're villages that are literally 2 blocks away from each other. So, I mean, at some point it feels a little watered down. There's some chieftaincy, some titles that are actually bought, believe it or not, right? So there are people whose history you never. I mean, this is an unpopular opinion. You may not like me for it. I don't care, but sometimes your history may be tied to a level of corruption in which your chieftaincy or your king title or your Eze title was bought because that person had enough resources in order to pay someone to call him chief. Can you imagine? But it's the truth. Because I always ask people, like, if you're such a queen and such a king, then why are you here? Why are you not ruling your nation? Or why are you not in line in the court getting ready to take over? Why are you going to Nigeria and saying, ew, they don't have any light. There's no light, no electricity. I want to go back to the US. Why do you have, these perceptions of Africa if you want to all of a sudden on the other side of the coin tell your friends and your associates that, oh yeah, we're tied into royalty. That's why my name is, Adenike, because I'm a princess. Are you really? So, I mean, a lot of times we have to understand that these terms of royalty have been used and abused so much and I feel, for me personally, that in the black community is used so much that people won't take it seriously. How can we? When people use the term that I'm a Nigerian prince and then they use that to scam people, right? People use, I mean, I don't hear other people talking about this stuff in South Africa, and maybe it happens in East and West Africa, and I'd love to interview some people who can tell me more about this. Like I said, I don't mind being wrong about this situation, but I'm gonna put it out there for sake of conversation. Black people I understand the positive side of wanting to use the terms and the concept of royalty as a way to uplift each other, but I also feel like we have a tendency to abuse certain terminologies, and then we water it down to the point where it's not taken seriously. We don't even take it seriously. And I'm the one that I am trying to take it upon myself to at least look at things rationally and without emotion and without passion, to simply say that if you want to, you can do it. You can be royalty, but you really have to understand what it takes to be a king. You really have to understand what it takes to be a queen. And what it means is you have to, one, pursue resources. You have to make yourself a better person than you are now. And if you already have the resources, learn to serve. Learn how to better and uplift those who may not be on your level at the moment. Learn how to train. Learn how to listen. Learn how to stop conflict. Learn when to rule with an iron fist, when to be harsh, when to be assertive. And learn when to be graceful and be merciful. Learn when to let other people slide. Learn when to give people other chances. Learn when to teach people and show them that there's a second chance in life. Learn how to receive the praise from people. Learn a little bit of humility, but also learn confidence. I mean, to me, I feel like these are things that we say in different ways, shapes, or forms, but these are the makings of royalty, in my opinion, right? And I think once you say these things, you don't use it just for the sake of inflating yourself, because as I mentioned before, when you really look at the reality that comes with being king and queens and all that, there's a price on your head. People are looking to you. People are waiting for you to fail. And you look at the history of kingdoms, you realize that there was always somebody else looking, waiting for you to fuck up. Waiting for you to mess up so that they can take a chance on overthrowing you. And that person can be your family member. That person could have been your brother, right? That term comes with a lot of negative things as well that we don't want to talk about. We don't want to talk about the greed. We don't want to talk about the deaths and the killings and the coups that happens for the sake and the name of royalty. But if we want to use that terminology to embrace each other, then you have to truly understand what it entails. But I think that we can use that as a black community, not just to uplift each other, but we should also use it as a way that I'm using it, which is a way to hold each other accountable. To truly understand that it's not that we just use it for the sake of trying to connect ourselves with a larger history, or for us to say that we believe in Wakanda, or we believe in Zamunda, and we create these mythological places that connect us together. We have a place that's already connecting us together, and it's called Africa. We have a place that's the history of man, where the Aboriginal man was created. That's us. We have that already. We don't need to necessarily falsify that. Whether there's royalty or not, be proud of your history and the fact that you, as a black person, you have the ability to do something that no one else can really do. You have the ability to build bridges. You have a history that's shown that you've built nations on nations. You have the history to show that when you're back against the wall, that you know how to overcome in any part of the world. You are leaders, you are servers, you are farmers, you are hunters, you are craftsmen, you are builders of these nations. The world is looking for us to figure out who we really are, how we can stop classifying ourselves and all pushing for the top, and understand how we can all play our role to make our community a healthier community. Once we start to understand and allow people who are natural leaders to lead and be field generals, once we allow those who are servers and workers to continue to build and train other people to work after them, once we're able to start teaching and educating each other and really filling into our natural roles in this black community, once we start to reach out to our brothers and sisters in the other part of the region or the other part of the world and start understanding how we can now not worry too much about the history we had in the past, but now start to build a better future. Because a lot of the times, as I mentioned before, history never lies, historians do, but the history was stripped away. So instead of spending so much time trying to find that history, why can't we spend a lot more time invested in building the future in which we can properly record the history that we're making now for our future generations to really view us as the kings and queens that we want to be now through the actions that I just laid out for you, being the leaders and servers and generals that we can be today, so that our future generation can truly refer to us as kings and queens and really understand that we are royalty based on what we do today, tomorrow and next tomorrow, and for the years to come, that we can truly create that black royalty and not just worry about what happened 200 BC. So I'll leave it at that. That's going to conclude it for this episode. I thank you for listening to me rant. If you have any differing opinions about what I just said, and you may not completely agree, please know that I welcome all rebuttals. I welcome all different thoughts and ideologies. I am not a hater, but I am a facilitator of great discussion. So if you would like to hit me up, please feel free to do so at blacktransnational_. You email me blacktransnational17@gmail.com, or you can shoot me a tweet on Twitter, NBI Transnational. Thank you again for listening to the show. If you like what you heard, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe the podcast. It's been lovely talking to you all. I hope that I can be able to have a guest on the show next time. But if not, I hope you enjoy listening to me talk, and I hope we can have more of a conversation moving forward. My name is Dr. Kalechi Bay Lamberts. My black is transnational, and I hope by the end of this, yours will be too. Have a good one.